The rain had already soaked through their uniforms by the time the Marines reached the crest of Henderson Ridge. Guadalcanal's jungle didn't ease anyone into its misery, it swallowed them whole. Thick vines curled around boots, insects hummed in clouds, and the distant rumble of surf was drowned by the constant patter of tropical rain. To the platoon moving up the ridge in the fading light, it felt like the world was closing in. Their orders were simple on paper: hold the ridge, watch for enemy movement, and make sure nothing broke through toward Henderson Field, the airstrip that had become the beating heart of the American foothold in the Pacific. Intelligence suggested only small Japanese patrols in the area. Nothing major, nothing they couldn't handle. But Second Lieutenant Mark Harlow, leading the platoon, felt the same tension twisting in his stomach that veterans often describe before something went wrong. The ridge was too quiet, the jungle too still. Even the birds seemed to avoid this stretch of land. It was the kind of silence that felt engineered, as if the island itself knew what was coming. The Marines set up positions along the ridge line as dusk settled. The slope dropped sharply into thick vegetation, impossible to see through even with binoculars. Machine gun teams dug hasty pits despite the mud, while riflemen spread out along what little high ground existed. The ridge wasn't wide, it wasn't strong, it wasn't even a proper defensive position. But it overlooked the most direct route toward the airfield. If the Japanese pushed here, this platoon was the only thing between them and the heart of the American presence on Guadalcanal. Harlow checked the radio, a battered, temperamental set that hated moisture, and tried to get a status update from battalion. Static. Faint voices. Nothing clear. He frowned. Rain and jungle canopy always played havoc with signals, but this level of interference felt different. "We'll get better reception when the weather shifts," the radio man said, forcing optimism he didn't believe. Harlow nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. Guadalcanal had taught him one thing quickly: when you needed communication most, that's when it tended to die. As night approached, a thick fog rolled up the ridge. Marines tightened their grips on rifles, checked ammunition, and lowered their voices to whispers. The jungle breathed around them, a chorus of distant rustles, unseen creatures, and dripping water. But beneath that natural rhythm, something else lay hidden. Movement. Not loud, not obvious, but present. Subtle shifts in brush, a faint tremor in the ground. The kind of sound disciplined soldiers made when they didn't want to be heard. Private Rourke, posted on the eastern flank, leaned closer to Harlow. "Sir, I think something's out there. Multiple somethings." Harlow crouched, listening. At first he heard only rain, then slowly the pattern emerged. Steps, many of them, moving with purpose. He keyed the radio, trying again. "Battalion, this is Ridge Platoon. We've got possible movement in force. Request confirmation on troop activity." Static answered him. He tried again, more static. He lowered the handset and looked at his men. Their faces were tense, alert, already understanding without needing to hear it spoken. The platoon wasn't alone on this ridge, and whatever was coming through the jungle, it wasn't a patrol. Harlow steadied his breath, scanning the pitch-black vegetation below. "Positions," he whispered. "Stay sharp. We hold this ridge no matter what." The men settled into the mud, eyes fixed on the darkness swallowing the slope. Rain fell harder, fog thickened, and the island exhaled, as if bracing for the storm about to break. Night on Guadalcanal wasn't darkness, it was obliteration. The ridge vanished beneath a blanket of fog and shadows so thick the Marines could barely see their own hands. Their world shrank to the small muddy patch of earth beneath them, the damp weight of their rifles, and the uneasy rhythm of their own breathing. Lightning flashed somewhere deep in the jungle, brightening the canopy for an instant. In that brief white burst, Harlow saw what he had feared: outlines, multiple, moving, advancing silently through the brush. The silhouettes vanished as quickly as they appeared. "Contact?" whispered Corporal Dawson, his voice barely audible. Not yet, Harlow murmured, but they're coming. Every man could feel it. The shift in the air, the pressure, the slow encirclement of something deliberate and calculating. Guadalcanal was full of rumors, and one of them was that Japanese forces preferred to attack at night, using darkness as their cloak and chaos as their ally. The Marines had laughed at the stories in daylight. Now the humor was gone. The first real sign came not as a shout or a gunshot, but as a soft rhythmic rustling, like dozens of feet brushing gently against wet leaves. It carried through the fog in pulses, growing louder, then fading, as if the jungle itself were breathing. Rourke swallowed hard. Sir, that's a lot more than a patrol. Harlow steadied his rifle. Hold until we see them. No wasted rounds. But visibility was nearly zero, and the enemy seemed to know it. Shapes flickered in the fog, always too far away to identify, always disappearing before a Marine could line up a shot. It was psychological warfare, and it was working. The radio crackled suddenly. Ridge Platoon. Repeat. Hold. Enemy movement expected. Then static swallowed the rest. Harlow keyed the handset again. Battalion, confirm enemy strength. Are we looking at a full unit? No answer, just static and rain. The Marines tightened their perimeter. Machine gun crews checked their angles, wiping water from the belts. Grenadiers loosened the tabs on their pouches. Riflemen dug their elbows deeper into the mud. The whispers in the jungle grew louder. Then silence. Total, crushing silence. It lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like a warning shot from the island itself. Eyes open, Dawson whispered. Lightning flashed again. This time the shapes were closer. Some crouched low. Others moved in disciplined lines. A few seemed to be signaling. The Japanese were positioning themselves, preparing, coordinating. Harlow felt his heartbeat slow to a controlled, icy rhythm. Get ready, he whispered. They're about to hit us. The jungle exhaled again, a long, low breath of wind that carried the scent of wet earth and something else, something metallic. Then a single sound broke the silence, a branch snapping, sharp, close. It was the signal, not from the Marines, from the attackers. Figures rushed forward through the fog, swift and low, trying to close the distance before gunfire could pin them down. Harlow raised his hand. Hold. Shapes approached. Boots splashed mud. Shadows tightened. The ridge trembled beneath them. Hold. The first silhouette crossed the boundary where shape became certainty. Fire. The night exploded. Muzzle flashes lit the ridge like lightning trapped in the earth. The machine gun roared. Rifles cracked. Shadows scattered and ducked for cover. The jungle that had whispered now screamed with noise and chaos, but the line held, for now. And as Harlow reloaded in the darkness, rain pouring down his helmet, he understood something with chilling clarity. This wasn't the attack. This was only the beginning. The probing hand before the true blow. The ridge was about to face hell. The gunfire faded as suddenly as it began. One moment the ridge was a storm of muzzle flashes and echoing shots. The next the jungle slipped back into silence. Heavy, humid, unnerving. The Marines waited, rifles trained downslope, breaths tight and shallow. No one spoke. No one dared. Harlow listened for movement but heard only the rain tapping leaves like distant fingers. The Japanese had melted back into the jungle, not defeated, not repelled, just withdrawn, studying, calculating. They're testing us, Dawson whispered. Harlow nodded. They want to know our positions before they hit hard. The radio crackled again, faint and broken. Multiple enemy units, movement near the Guadalcanal, hold ridge, reinforcements delayed. Then static swallowed the frequency. Delayed, Rourke muttered. We're the only ones up here. Harlow forced calm into his voice. That means we dig in deeper, check ammo, redistribute where needed. But the truth gnawed at him. They were alone on a narrow piece of high ground with limited ammunition, poor visibility, and failing communications. If the Japanese attacked in numbers, real numbers, the ridge would become a choke point that could bury them. Lightning flickered again, briefly lighting the slope below. For an instant, Harlow saw what he feared. Branches disturbed, brush compressed, footprints forming fresh patterns in the mud. Movement was everywhere, controlled, coordinated. They're setting up for something bigger, he said quietly. The second attack didn't come with whispers. It came with momentum. Brush rustled, feet splashed through mud, shapes advanced low and fast, using the thick vegetation as cover. The Marines opened fire, but this wave was tighter, more disciplined. The enemy moved in small teams, shifting angles, trying to reach the ridge before the line could stabilize. Machine gun fire ripped through the darkness. Tracers streaked into the fog, slicing thin red lines across the night. The jungle erupted with return fire, controlled bursts, no shouting, just the calculated pressure of trained soldiers working in unison. Bullets snapped into trees and rocks. Bark exploded above the Marines' heads. The ridge vibrated with tension, each man feeling the enemy closing the gap. "Left flank is moving!" Dawson shouted. Rourke and two riflemen swung their barrels toward the threat, firing bursts into shifting shadows. A figure dropped behind a tree, another darted back into the brush. But the Japanese kept advancing. A grenade landed in the mud near Harlow's position, a dull, heavy thump. He grabbed it and hurled it back down the slope seconds before it detonated, sending a muted flash through the fog. Adrenaline surged. The men fought harder. The rain intensified, pounding the ridge, masking footsteps and blurring shapes. The ground turned to sludge beneath them, rifles jammed with mud, magazines slipped from wet fingers, and still the attackers pressed forward. A squad reached the lower rocks of the ridge, trying to climb and breach the line. Dawson's machine gun opened up, sending a controlled burst that forced them back into the brush. The barrels steamed in the rain. The crew worked mechanically, feeding wet ammunition belts through shaking hands. Minutes stretched into something heavier, slower, a grind of endurance against exhaustion. Finally, after what felt like hours, the enemy pressure eased. Not fully, not in retreat, but enough for the Marines to feel a sliver of breathing room. Harlow scanned the slope. They're regrouping. That wasn't the main assault. What was it then? Rourke asked. A curtain raiser. The platoon, soaked, muddy, and running low on ammunition, tightened their perimeter again. Each man knew the truth without anyone saying it. If the next attack was larger, if it came with the force the Japanese were known for, the ridge might not survive the night. Harlow looked into the fog-choked jungle and whispered to himself, "Hold. Just hold." Because he understood now. The enemy wasn't trying to break their line yet. They were trying to break their nerve. Midnight on Guadalcanal didn't arrive with calm. It arrived with pressure. The air grew hotter, heavier, as if the entire jungle leaned inward on the ridge. Fog thickened until it felt like the Marines were breathing cotton. The rain eased into a slow drizzle, and with the quiet came something worse: anticipation. The Japanese had vanished again. No footsteps, no whispers, no probing shots. Just an oppressive silence that wrapped itself around every man on the ridge. Marines exchanged uneasy glances. They knew enough about night fighting here to recognize the pattern. When the jungle went still, the enemy was not retreating. They were preparing. Harlow crouched beside the radio operator, who was drying the handset with a scrap of cloth. "Try again," he whispered. The operator twisted knobs, tapped the casing, listened. Static, a faint hum, nothing more. "They may not even hear us, sir," he said. "Rain got into the wiring, or something's jamming the signal." Harlow nodded grimly. Whether it was weather, terrain, or the enemy, one thing was clear: They were cut off. Corporal Dawson made his way to the lieutenant. "Sir, the men are nervous. They've fought in the dark before, but this feels different." Harlow didn't disagree. The Japanese weren't rushing them, weren't firing blindly into their positions. They were thinking, shaping the battlefield, waiting for the exact moment when fear and exhaustion softened the line. A distant crack echoed through the jungle. Not gunfire, wood, a tree limb breaking under weight, then another and another. Harlow raised his hand. Positions. They're moving. Marines sank into the mud, gripping rifles slick with moisture. The ridge became a line of shadows in prone stances, eyes fixed on darkness they couldn't penetrate. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then the jungle lit up with a sudden burst of flares, not American ones, but Japanese. Harsh white light washed over the ridge, burning away the night in an instant. Every Marine was exposed, outlined against the ground. "Down!" Harlow shouted. Bullets snapped through the air. Branches exploded above them. Dirt kicked up like rain in reverse. The Japanese had timed the illumination perfectly, firing from concealed firing pits farther down the slope. Dawson's machine gun roared back, sweeping through fog and brush. Riflemen fired in controlled bursts, aiming at muzzle flashes flickering in the distance. The ridge lit up with chaos, flares overhead, shadows dancing wildly, the wet earth shaking from the noise. But the flares weren't the attack. They were the distraction. From the flank came rushing footsteps, fast, low, coordinated. Several enemy teams pushed up a narrow bend in the slope, using the chaos to get dangerously close. Rourke spotted them first. "Left side, moving up fast." Harlow scrambled across the ridge, sliding in mud as he repositioned men. The Marines shifted instantly, opening fire on the advancing shapes. The flashes briefly revealed enemy helmets and uniforms before disappearing into fog. The attackers pressed harder. One enemy soldier reached a low root system below the line and tried to climb upward. A Marine knocked him back with a burst. Another silhouette broke from the brush and advanced to within yards before disappearing again behind a fallen tree. The ridge became a shifting battleground with no clear front. Every Marine fought in their own pocket of darkness, relying on instinct and the faint glow from fading flares. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating everything for a half second. And in that half second, Harlow saw the truth. The Japanese weren't trying to seize the ridge all at once. They were trying to get inside it, slip teams through, infiltrate gaps, unravel the platoon from within. "Close ranks," he shouted. "No gaps. They're trying to flank and bleed us out." Rain returned in a sudden sheet, extinguishing the last of the flares. Darkness swallowed the ridge again, total and suffocating. For 3 minutes, or maybe 30, the fighting devolved into scattered bursts of gunfire, strained breathing, and shapes darting where they shouldn't be. Marines pulled back into a tighter formation, linking sectors of fire, regaining control inch by inch. Finally, gradually, the pressure eased. The enemy slipped back into the jungle. Their footsteps grew faint, then stopped entirely. Silence returned, not peaceful, not comforting. A silence that hinted the night was far from over. Dawson exhaled shakily. "Sir, was that the main attack?" Harlow stared into the jungle that had swallowed their attackers. "No," he said. "They were preparing us." He wiped mud from his face, heart still hammering. "The real attack hasn't even started. Dawn didn't break on Guadalcanal. It leaked." A dull gray seeped into the sky, filtering through the canopy like smoke. The Marines blinked against the faint light, exhausted, soaked, and half deaf from the night's chaos. No one had slept. No one dared. The ridge felt different now, as if the jungle itself had shifted closer during the darkness. Harlow moved along the line, checking each position. Eyes were red and unfocused, Helmets were dented, uniforms torn, hands trembling from adrenaline that had burned too long. Yet every Marine still held his rifle, every man still covering his sector. Dawson met him halfway. "Sir, ammo's getting thin. Some men are down to a handful of rounds." Harlow nodded. They all knew this moment was coming. On this island, supply lines were fragile, and platoons on extended posts often found themselves fighting with whatever remained in their pockets. But hearing it spoken aloud gave the truth more weight. "How's the radio?" Harlow asked. The operator shook his head. "Still nothing clear. I get bits and pieces. Something about heavy fighting near the coast. They might not have anyone to spare." Harlow didn't show frustration, though fatigue carved shadows beneath his eyes. Reinforcements weren't coming anytime soon. The ridge was theirs alone. As the morning light strengthened, the jungle revealed the damage from the night's fighting. Shell craters, shattered branches, and churned mud lined the slopes. Here and there were signs of enemy teams that had gotten too close. Abandoned packs, footprints, disturbed brush, but no bodies. The Japanese rarely left anything behind. Rourke stared down the slope, rubbing his neck. "Feels like they're watching us," he muttered. "They are," Dawson replied. "They always are." Movement flickered in the lower brush. Not an attack, just a shift of shadows, too far away to engage. The Japanese were conserving strength too, choosing their moment with eerie patience. Harlow knelt beside the machine gun pit where the barrel lay cooling, streaked with mud. The gunner, Evans, looked up with tired determination. "We can hold another wave, sir. Just need more belts." "We'll make them last," Harlow said. He scanned the terrain. The ridge wasn't built for defense. Too narrow, too exposed, flanked by jungle that could hide an entire regiment. What little advantage they had came from elevation and resolve, but resolve alone didn't stop rifle fire. By midday, the sun burned away the fog, revealing the valley below, and what the Marines saw tightened every throat along the ridge. Fresh movement, multiple groups, more than before. Figures maneuvered between trees, coordinated and deliberate, with the calm efficiency of troops preparing for a large-scale assault. It wasn't a raid, it wasn't probing. This was assembly. Dawson lowered his binoculars slowly. "That's a lot of them, sir." Harlow didn't speak for a moment. "They know this ridge leads straight to the airfield," he said finally. "If they take this ground, Henderson is exposed. They won't stop coming." The Marines felt the truth settle into their bones. They weren't holding a hill. They were holding the key to the entire island. Rain returned without warning, slamming the ridge in a heavy sheet that blurred visibility once more. Thunder rolled overhead. Harlow felt the shift immediately. The Japanese favored attacks in storms, knowing the jungle swallowed sound and sight in equal measure. The radio crackled, faint but clearer than before. "Enemy offensive expected. Hold. Support delayed." "Delayed again?" Rourke muttered bitterly. The operator tried for more clarity. Nothing. Harlow leaned in close. "If battalion is warning of an offensive, that means this isn't just our ridge. The whole island is under pressure. That means we hold, no matter how long they take." The ridge, the rain, the jungle, all seemed to listen. Thunder cracked. A distant shout echoed through the trees. Then another and another. Drums? No. Footsteps. Many. The Japanese were moving, positioning, closing in from the base of the slope. Harlow inhaled slowly, steadying the tension building in his chest. "This is it," he said. "They're coming again." Marines gripped their rifles, checked their last magazines, swallowed dry fear. The jungle below darkened, as if an unseen tide was rising. Dawson whispered, "Sir, if this is only the start, how long do you think we can hold?" Harlow's answer was quiet, calm, and absolute. "As long as Henderson Field needs us to." The ridge didn't just belong to them now, it depended on them. The rain turned violent by late afternoon, hammering the ridge with tropical fury. Sheets of water cascaded down the slope, turning foxholes into muddy basins and carving small rivers through the Marines' positions. Visibility shrank until everything beyond 10 meters dissolved into a shifting blur of green and gray. Guadalcanal wasn't just a battlefield, it was an enemy. Harlow wiped water from his eyes, though it made no difference. He could barely see Dawson's silhouette 2 steps away. The jungle below was a solid wall of noise, wind, rain, and something else lurking beneath it, the steady rhythmic movement of organized troops. The Japanese were using the storm as cover. "They're getting close," Dawson muttered, raising his voice just enough to be heard. "Rain's masking everything." "That's why they waited," Harlow replied. "They want to be on top of us before we see them." The radio sputtered beside them, half drowned in runoff. The operator hunched over it, shielding it with his body. A burst of static cut through the storm, followed by a faint voice. "Heavy activity, multiple directions, hold line at all costs." Then silence again. The operator looked up. "Sir, that sounded like other units are getting hit too." Harlow nodded grimly. The ridge wasn't isolated. The entire island was erupting. The Japanese offensive was moving like a tide across Guadalcanal, and Henderson Ridge was directly in its path. A sudden shout from the eastern flank cut through the rain. "Movement! Fast!" Harlow swung his rifle toward the sound just as dark shapes surged through the jungle, not in lines or scattered teams, but in a broad coordinated advance. The storm hid their exact numbers, but the tempo of their approach was unmistakable. "They're going for a full push," Dawson shouted. "Brace up." Marines raised rifles, wiped rain from their sights, and steadied themselves in positions barely holding together under the downpour. The enemy emerged, not all at once, but in sudden bursts, silhouettes breaking from foliage, advancing low and quick. The Marines opened fire, but rain distorted their aim, bullets slicing through sheets of water. The enemy answered with return fire that cracked through the storm, sending Marines ducking deeper into mud-filled pits. The ridge erupted into chaos. Machine guns jammed from the moisture, rifle bolts stuck, grenades slipped from wet hands. The environment punished both sides, but the Japanese used the terrain with uncanny precision, pushing through low brush and broken roots, closing distance rapidly. Rourke fired at a silhouette climbing the rocks, driving it back. Another shadow darted toward the central line, disappearing between trees before reappearing closer. Dawson swept the machine gun across the slope, trying to suppress the advance, but the belt snagged with mud-spattered grit. "Clear it!" Harlow shouted. Dawson's crew worked frantically, stripping the belt and feeding it again while enemy rounds sliced into the ridge around them. A flash of lightning tore open the sky, and for an instant the entire slope lit up. The Marines saw them clearly, dozens of enemy soldiers pushing upward from multiple angles. No shouting, no hesitation, just forward momentum. The lightning vanished. Darkness returned. The only certainty was their closeness. "They're almost here," Rourke yelled. "Hold the line," Harlow commanded, voice steady despite the storm's fury. Rifle fire cracked. Shadows fell back, regrouped, surged again. The ridge trembled under the weight of the assault. The Marines fought with everything they had, conserving rounds, firing only when movement was undeniable. A grenade skittered across the mud. Harlow kicked it away before it detonated in a muffled thump, sending a spray of mud into the air. Evans' machine gun finally roared back to life, cutting through the brush and forcing the enemy to retreat several meters. But the victory was brief. The rain swallowed visibility again, and more silhouettes pressed forward. "Sir!" Dawson shouted. "If this keeps up, they'll reach the crest." Harlow's heart pounded, but his voice stayed firm. "Then we don't let them. This ridge is the last thing standing between them and the airfield. We hold it." A deeper rumble rolled through the storm, thunder but with a different rhythm. It came again, louder this time. Not thunder at all. Artillery, distant, American, a faint hope. But hope didn't stop the storm or the enemy closing in through it. The Japanese regrouped below, their silhouettes shifting through the sheets of rain, preparing for another push. The Marines steadied their rifles, mud dripping from their helmets, knowing the next wave could break the ridge entirely. Harlow inhaled the heavy, wet air. "Get ready," he said quietly. Because the storm wasn't their enemy, the storm was their warning, and the real attack was still coming. The rain eased just enough for shapes to reappear in the jungle below, dark silhouettes shifting between tree trunks, regrouping, realigning. The enemy was adjusting tactics. They had tested the ridge through the storm, found its weak points, mapped the terrain in their minds. Now they were preparing to strike again, this time with precision. Harlow moved along the line, checking each position. Marines were soaked, shivering, caked in mud from helmet to boots, eyes hollow but alert. Every man felt the tension climbing, like the air itself was winding a cord tighter and tighter. Dawson pressed his hand to the ridge floor. "Sir, feel that?" Harlow crouched. Through the soft drizzle, through the ground, he felt a pulse. Rhythmic, coordinated, boots, many of them. "They're forming up," Harlow said quietly, "and this time it's not small teams." The radio operator tried one more time to reach battalion. The handset hissed, crackled, then briefly opened. Heavy contact, hold ridge, air and artillery delayed. Then the signal died completely. The platoon exchanged glances. There was no backup coming. Not now. Maybe not at all. Movement erupted suddenly on the left flank. Fast, low, silent. Several enemy teams pushed up the slope in a coordinated rush. The Marines opened fire, but the Japanese used the terrain with terrifying discipline, slipping behind roots, stumps, and churned mud. Rain splashed across helmets as tracer rounds streaked through the gray. "Shift left! Shift left!" Dawson shouted, swinging his machine gun toward the surge. Evans fed the belt, and the weapon thundered to life. The burst tore into the advancing shapes, forcing them to hit the ground. For a moment, the line stabilized until a second group emerged on the right, mirroring the maneuver. "They're hitting both sides!" Rourke yelled. Harlow's mind raced. The enemy wasn't trying to break through one point. They were trying to stretch the line until it snapped. "Pull in tighter," he ordered. "Shorten the perimeter. Don't let them wrap around us." Marines crawled through mud, repositioning under fire, consolidating into a tighter arc along the crest. The ridge shrank beneath them, forcing men shoulder to shoulder. It wasn't ideal. It wasn't even good. But it prevented a flank, for now. The forest erupted again as the enemy advanced. Gunfire flashed between trees. Rounds cracked overhead, splintering branches. The air stung with wet earth and the metallic bite of spent cartridges. Rourke fired until his rifle clicked empty. "I'm out!" "Here!" Dawson tossed him a half-full magazine, the last from his pouch. A grenade rolled near the central line. Harlow kicked it downhill and flattened himself as a dull explosion shook the slope. Dirt showered the Marines, mixing with the rain until everything felt like grit. The enemy closed in to within 20 yards, dangerously close for such a narrow ridge. Harlow fired controlled bursts, forcing silhouettes back into the brush. Each time he bought a few seconds, each time they returned. Minutes bled into each other. The ridge shook under constant pressure. Marines were sweating despite the rain, struggling to stay focused as fatigue dug into their bones. Then, suddenly, the enemy fell back again. No shouts, no chaos. Just a coordinated withdrawal into the jungle. The ridge went quiet except for the rain. Dawson exhaled shakily. "Sir, Did we stop them? No, Harlow said softly. They're adjusting again. He surveyed the line. Men were down to their last magazines, machine gun belts were nearly empty. Several Marines nursed shallow wounds from shrapnel and branches. The ridge wasn't just tired, it was bending. Rourke wiped rain from his brow. How long you think we can hold like this? Harlow looked at the jungle below, at the faint shapes repositioning, at the nervous quiet that always came before violence. As long as we have to, he said. Rumor said the Japanese preferred overwhelming attacks at night, when fear and darkness worked in their favor, and night was coming again. The ridge seemed to shrink under the weight of that truth. The enemy wasn't done. They were preparing for the blow that mattered, the one meant to finish the ridge entirely. And Harlow understood they were running out of daylight and ammunition faster than they were running out of enemies. Night fell like a curtain drawn by an invisible hand, sudden, total, unforgiving. The ridge, already fragile in daylight, seemed to vanish beneath the weight of darkness. No moon, no stars. Only the smell of wet earth and the distant hum of insects swallowed by the jungle's deeper, heavier silence. The Marines tightened their positions, huddled shoulder to shoulder along the shortened crest. Their ammunition was low, their bodies trembling from exhaustion and cold, but their eyes remained fixed, downslope, searching for a movement they knew they wouldn't be able to see. Harlow crouched between the machine gun pit and the radio operator, checking both by touch more than sight. Stay alert, he whispered. They'll use the dark. Dawson's voice was a quiet rasp. Sir, they used everything else already. This is the only thing left. And he was right. The Japanese weren't just attacking, they were shaping the battlefield. The jungle in daylight had been an obstacle. At night, it became their ally. The first sign came as a faint rustling, deliberate, controlled, coming from multiple angles. The sound barely rose above the whisper of wind through wet leaves, but every Marine heard it. Hold fire, Harlow murmured. Wait for a silhouette. But the enemy didn't give them one. Instead, a sudden burst of coordinated noise erupted, metal striking wood, voices calling commands, footsteps rushing low through the darkness. It wasn't a charge, it was psychological pressure crafted to overwhelm the senses. Then silence, then another burst, closer. The enemy was moving in unpredictable rhythms, forcing the Marines to shift left and right, unsure where the true attack would come. Rourke swallowed hard. Sir, they're playing with us. No, Harlow whispered. They're positioning. A flare burst overhead, not American. A harsh red glow washed across the ridge, revealing everything for a heartbeat. The Japanese were already halfway up the slope. Contact front, Dawson shouted. The Marines opened fire, their rifles flashing like sparks against the red-lit jungle. The machine gun thundered, scattering shadows that regrouped just beyond the light. The flare dimmed, plunging the ridge back into suffocating darkness. Rain began again, not heavy, but enough to distort vision, amplify sound, and mask movement. Shapes crawled closer. A grenade clattered near Harlow's boot. He swept it downhill with the butt of his rifle. A muffled explosion shook the ground. Dirt showered the line. Right side! They're climbing! A Marine yelled. Dawson pivoted the machine gun, firing into the darkness. The belt jammed halfway through. Evans fought to clear it while Harlow and Rourke fired blind toward the movement pressing up the slope. The Japanese were relentless. Every minute, another shadow tried to climb through the roots. Every minute, another Marine fired his last few rounds. Harlow felt the danger tightening around the ridge like a vice. They didn't have the ammunition for a long fight. They didn't even have enough visibility for a short one. Then he heard it, a sound worse than gunfire, worse than shouting. Close breathing, right below the crest. He raised his rifle just as a dark shape lunged through the brush. Harlow fired point blank, sending the silhouette tumbling downslope. Another shape appeared on his left. Dawson tackled it, both men sliding through mud before Dawson scrambled back up, panting and soaked. The ridge was breaking apart into small pockets of desperate fighting, each Marine isolated in his own circle of darkness. "Pull in tighter," Harlow ordered. "Don't let them split the line." The men crawled, stumbled, regrouped inch by inch, forming a ring around the center of the crest. It wasn't a formation, it was survival. More movement surged through the jungle, but this time it wasn't pressing upward, it was repositioning. Harlow froze. "They're not trying to overrun us," he whispered. "They're trying to surround us." Dawson's breath caught. "Sir, if they close that circle—" "We hold," Harlow said firmly, though fear gnawed at his edges. The jungle around them pulsed with unseen footsteps. Night had become the enemy's weapon, and the ridge was shrinking again, not from geography, but from fear, fatigue, and the tightening grip of an army that refused to break. The Marines steadied themselves for a fight they could barely see, a fight where any shadow could be death, and every sound could be the last warning they heard. The night wasn't over, and the real encirclement was only beginning. By the time the moon finally broke through the clouds, the ridge looked less like a defensive position and more like a fragment of ground the jungle was trying to reclaim. Mud swallowed ankles, helmets dripped. Rifles felt heavier with every passing minute. The Marines leaned against roots and rocks, catching breaths that tasted of damp earth and fear. But the moonlight brought something far worse: clarity. Shadows moved on all sides. Harlow saw it first, faint silhouettes shifting behind trees to the south, then to the east, then directly below the crest. The Japanese weren't attacking in waves anymore. They were closing the circle, tightening it with deliberate precision. Dawson confirmed it in a low whisper. "Sir, they're surrounding us." Harlow already knew. The enemy was preparing for a final constriction, squeezing the line until there was no line left to hold. He gathered the men close, not for a speech, but for survival. "Listen, they're trying to crush us inward. That means we stay tight, connected, no gaps. If someone moves, you cover them. If someone falls, you pull them in. We don't let them peel us apart." Rourke glanced at his rifle. "Sir, I'm down to 4 rounds." "You're not the only one," Dawson added. It was the reality none of them had wanted to say aloud. Ammunition was nearly gone. Some Marines had only a bullet or two. Others carried bayonets now, knuckles white, knowing they might need them. The jungle stirred. A rustle to the west, a low whisper to the east, a faint crunch of a boot on wet soil behind them. The encirclement wasn't theoretical anymore. Evans swung the machine gun around, but there was no clear target, only flickers of movement that vanished before he could aim. The Japanese were moving with uncanny discipline, positioning themselves just beyond visibility. Then a single shot cracked from the north flank. A Marine grunted and fell into the mud. The line contracted instantly, everyone tightening inward as the darkness beyond seemed to lean closer. "Contact left," Rourke hissed, but no one fired. They couldn't afford to. Another silhouette appeared, then vanished behind a tree. The Japanese weren't attacking. They were testing reactions, studying the shrinking perimeter, waiting for the perfect moment to strike the final blow. Harlow's breath slowed as he listened to the night. "They're not rushing us," he whispered. "They're waiting until we're too tired to respond." As if answering his words, a flare shot skyward, a brief, brilliant flash that painted the entire ridge in harsh white light. And for a heartbeat, the Marines saw everything. Dozens of enemy soldiers crouched behind roots and rocks, positioned in a ring around the crest. Every angle covered, every escape cut off, every Marine exposed in the flare's unforgiving glow. The flare fizzled out. Darkness returned. The encirclement tightened further. Dawson exhaled shakily. Sir, this is it. Harlow placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. We hold. We force them to come up this ridge. If they want it, they'll have to take it from men still breathing. The enemy moved again, coordinated rustling, the quiet clink of metal, steps inching closer. The ring was compressing like a noose. Then the radio crackled. A broken signal at first, static, a hum, then words, faint, strained but real. Air support, incoming, hold your position, don't break. The Marines froze. Hope didn't explode in them. It flickered, cautious, almost afraid to exist. But it was something. Dawson grinned despite the mud on his teeth. They heard us? Someone finally heard us. Harlow nodded slowly. We just have to survive long enough for them to get here. Below the ridge, the Japanese shifted again. The ring was nearly closed. Their final assault was minutes, maybe seconds, away. Rourke clenched his last 2 rounds. Sir, how do we hold against this? Harlow looked at the men, exhausted, muddy, far past their limits, and spoke with the steady calm of someone who had accepted the cost long before this night. We hold because Henderson Field is behind us, and if we fall... He tightened his grip on his rifle. The island falls with us. The jungle exhaled one last time, a low, collective breath before violence. The encirclement was complete, and the final attack was about to begin. The final assault began without a shout, without warning, just a sudden surge of motion as shadows broke from the jungle on every side. The Japanese charged low and fast, using the darkness as a shield, pressing toward the shrinking circle of Marines who braced themselves for the impact. Harlow steadied his rifle, 2 rounds left. Dawson tightened his grip on the machine gun, praying the belt wouldn't jam again. Rourke crouched beside a fallen log, clutching a single magazine like it was the last thread of hope. The first wave hit the left flank. Figures erupted from the brush, silhouettes in the rain-soaked dark. Marines fired in controlled bursts, each shot precious. Shapes stumbled, regrouped, advanced again. The ridge shook with the pressure. Right side, they're climbing, Evans shouted. Harlow pivoted, firing his last rounds to halt a pair of attackers scrambling up the rocks. The rifle clicked empty. He dropped it and drew his sidearm, moving on instinct more than thought. The Japanese pressed closer. 10 yards, 8, 5. The line bent but didn't break. Marines fought shoulder to shoulder, pushing back silhouettes that seemed carved from the darkness itself. A flare burst overhead, Japanese again, drowning the crest in harsh white light. And in that brutal flash, Harlow finally saw the truth. The enemy wasn't trying to overrun them in a single direction. They were collapsing inward from every angle at once. Close ranks, no gaps, Harlow shouted. The Marines tightened their formation until they were nearly back-to-back, a human ring defending the last scrap of the ridge. Bullets snapped above them, mud splashed, roots splintered under rifle fire. Rourke emptied his rifle and switched to his bayonet, breath ragged. Dawson kicked an attacker back down the slope, then dragged the machine gun around with a grunt, firing a short, desperate burst that kept another group from breaching the circle. How much longer? Someone yelled. Harlow didn't answer. He didn't need to. The radio did. A sudden, sharp crackle cut through the chaos. This is Eagle Flight. Approaching Henderson Ridge. Mark your positions. The operator nearly sobbed from relief. We're here. We're still alive. Harlow grabbed the handset. Eagle Flight, the ridge is surrounded. Strike the lower slopes. Repeat, lower slopes. The reply came instantly. Copy, hold on. Then the sky roared. The first American aircraft streaked overhead, engine howling through the storm. A second followed, then a third. Their shadows flashed across the ridge as they dove toward the jungle below. A wall of explosions rolled across the lower slopes, not close enough to endanger the Marines, but devastating to the encircling forces. The jungle lit up in violent bursts of orange and white as the aircraft unleashed rockets and strafing runs. The ridge shook, the ground trembled, the encirclement began to unravel. Enemy silhouettes scrambled for cover. Some retreated downslope, others froze under the shock of the sudden air attack. The coordinated assault shattered in seconds, replaced by confusion and retreat. Dawson let out a shaking laugh. "They're pulling back, they're pulling back!" Evans collapsed to his knees, exhausted. Rourke stared at the sky, rain mixing with tears he didn't bother to hide. Harlow stayed standing, chest heaving, watching as the aircraft made another pass. The jungle below erupted again, and whatever remained of the final assault broke completely. The ridge was still theirs. Minutes later, silence settled. Not the threatening kind, but a tired, heavy calm. Reinforcements finally reached the crest just as the first light of dawn crawled over the horizon. Marines climbed the ridge expecting to find a massacre. Instead, they found a handful of mud-soaked men still standing their ground, some leaning on rifles, some sitting in exhaustion, all alive. A young officer approached Harlow, eyes wide. "Lieutenant, how did you hold this ridge?" Harlow looked over the shattered landscape, the mud, the broken branches, the scattered shell casings, and then at his men, who had given everything they had and more. "We didn't hold it," he said quietly. "We just didn't let it go." Word of the stand spread across Guadalcanal within hours. Commanders would later say the platoon's impossible defense kept the enemy from breaking through to Henderson Field, a stand that shaped the course of the campaign. But on that ridge, at dawn, the Marines weren't thinking of history. They were thinking of each other, of survival, of the ground they refused to surrender. The ridge hadn't fallen, because the men who held it didn't either.